Applied Kinesiology, Dr. Gary Dombey. Session 7 continues with AK and athletic performance. So we're going to look at athletic dysfunction as a function of how the muscles work when pursuing athletic activity. Quick review, basically two kinds of muscle fibers: the oxidative, oxygen-using, slower twitching aerobic fibers that tend to dominate more in endurance activities, and then the anaerobic, glucose-using, faster twitch fibers, which are more for quick strength. Either type of fiber should be able to contract for 20 repetitions without failing, ideally. So Dr. Goodhart discovered how you could evaluate aerobic muscle function when he was on the Olympic medical team back in 1980, the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, New York. There was a Canadian downhill skier who was unable to maintain his tuck throughout the full course, and so Dr. Goodhart ended up working with this athlete, even though he was Canadian and not American. But he found that his abdominal muscles were weakening partway through the course, and so that's really what got him started down the road of figuring out not only can we test muscles, but we can test them for prolonged function, and we can test them according to what type of fiber predominates in that particular muscle. So, for example, with aerobic, the way we test for aerobic function would be to test at about 1 test per second. So, for example, we would test a psoas, but we would keep testing it 1,000, 2, 1,000, and see if it could make it to about 20 repetitions before it started fatiguing. And often what is found, what Dr. Goodhart found early on, was a need for iron, and then other cofactors, pantothenic acid, B vitamins, things that were involved with the conversion of fat to ATP. So when you find a muscle that doesn't that functions abnormally with this test, then you would first go to the neurolymphatic reflex for that muscle and see if that re-strengthens it, or if that helps the muscle regain its optimal function. And then you would start testing nutrients from there. So anaerobic muscle testing, we would test it 2 to 3 times faster. So we would test the muscle at 2 to 3 times per second. Say, for example, a chest muscle, like a pec muscle, which has a higher ratio of fast twitch muscle fibers, we would test that muscle, for example, at a faster rate. We could also test it at a slow rate too, and see how they compare. What Dr. Goodhart found often was a need for pantothenic acid, which is needed to quickly convert glucose in the Krebs cycle, because of course anaerobic muscles basically burn up the glucose that's stored in the muscle, and when that glucose is done, then the muscle starts to fail. Aerobic fibers, of course, can, if they're working well, they kind of feed themselves on the run. They keep firing and they keep generating fuel on the fly, so to speak. You also want to check with anaerobic muscle test, you want to check the neurovascular reflex. I would check neurovascular and Chapman on both muscles, but specifically neurovascular will help you then determine if that muscle is getting enough circulation. So why would we use this? Well, it's helpful to find imbalances in the nervous system, for one thing. If a group of muscles weakens on one side, or one particular muscle weakens on one side of the body, but doesn't on the other, that's an indication that that there's an imbalance in the neurology. The anaerobic aerobic can uncover numerous underlying nutritional deficiencies that won't show up with just standard muscle testing. Things that have to do with the muscle's ability to get energy. So obviously where the rubber meets the road is the muscle's ability, or the muscle's ready access to ATP. So anything that's involved in making ATP available to that muscle, those are all nutritional considerations that can be addressed. And especially, what's especially helpful with aerobic muscle testing is ability to determine if the body is needing more essential fatty acids, either needing more in the diet or possibly better utilization, which is, I think, more often the case than just straight deficiency. And you'll see this is very helpful when you have people with recurrent injuries. You get things fixed and then it just keeps coming back. Of course, that can be many things, but this is one thing you want to consider when a particular pattern just keeps returning, especially in an athlete. Not just athletes, but especially in athletes. Athletes, I've always said, there's not that much difference between sports medicine and just regular medicine, or sports chiropractic and just regular chiropractic. It has to do with athletes take their bodies to a different level and do things that maybe aren't necessarily natural. In sports, you push yourself until you're tired, and then you keep pushing until the play is done, or the game is done, or the race is run, or whatever. And that puts athletes in a little bit different of a category, but obviously muscles are muscles and joints are joints, and physiology is physiology, whether you're an athlete or not. People who work for a living, construction, things like that, basically they're doing these repetitive, intense physical muscle activities all day long. Not just for an hour or two during a game, but all day long. And I think these sports injury models fit those people very well too. So some other things to consider with aerobic and anaerobic findings. Oral pH can be an indication that people are aerobically deficient. If they're driving, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. If they're driving themselves into a sympathetic overdrive, like improperly training, their oral pH often will start to move towards an acidic range. Now, a normal oral pH is 7.4, 7.2 to 7.4. Normal pH of the blood is about 7.4. Children can be much more alkaline. So checking oral pH along with this aerobic, anaerobic muscle testing can be very helpful. Dr. Phil Maffetone, if any of you aren't already familiar with him, is someone I'd like to draw your attention to. Dr. Phil Maffetone is a past president of the ICAK USA. He's a world-renowned fitness expert, has trained many high-level endurance athletes over the years, over decades. And he's written several really good books. He has a website that I direct patients to all the time, has some excellent articles on training, diet, all kinds of things. Anyway, we'll talk a little more about him later. I have some other books listed. So a basic tenet is if there is too little aerobic energy or anaerobic energy, then adding more aerobic activity or anaerobic activity is going to normalize muscle function. If there's too much aerobic or anaerobic energy, adding more will start to diminish. So too much or too little causes disease or causes problems or diminished function. So the way we do the aerobic challenge is we find one strong and one weak muscle. And I'll demonstrate this in the workshop. Patient slowly and alternately raises and lowers the legs 8 to 10 times as if they were walking at about 1 per second. Then we retest the muscles. Now in normal response, the weak muscle stays weak and the strong muscle stays strong because nothing's really changed. If you have aerobic deficiency, the weak muscle will normalize and the strong muscle stays strong. Like I said before, if you have a lack of aerobic function, then doing aerobic function is going to normalize a lot of the weak muscles. With aerobic excess, the weak muscle stays weak and the strong muscle becomes weak. So it blows everything out. So likewise with anaerobic challenge, we find a strong and a weak muscle. We have the patient clench their fists and then rapidly, powerfully flex and extend their arms and elbows like they're boxing for about 10 seconds. Fast twitch, fibers, working them in a fast twitch way. We retest the muscles. A normal response, weak muscle stays weak, strong muscle stays strong. Anaerobic excess, overtraining, for example. Weak muscle stays weak, strong muscle becomes weak, inhibited. Anaerobic deficiency, a weak muscle will be strong and strong muscle stays strong. So very similar to aerobics, just the type of testing is different. So other things to look for with anaerobic challenge is blood sugar problems, their diet, maybe not eating enough, emotions, and then of course overtraining. And this pertains to aerobic and anaerobic across the board. Diet's very important. A lot of young athletes, I would say more often than not, young athletes do not eat properly for what they're putting their bodies through. And a lot of the young athletes' problems are really stemming back to they're putting their body through these intense activities. There's a lot of psychological override. And then when the body needs fed and replenished, they're feeding it. They're feeding the body, processed food and sugar and just basically junk. So of course, at some point, something starts to break down. So I would say I've worked with young athletes all of my career and was a team doctor for 19 years for a local high school football team, a very successful football team. And by far the biggest challenge I had with those types of patients were diet. Getting them to eat, getting them to drink enough water, so on and so forth. Which brings us back to Dr. Phil Maffetone is the originator of the 180 minus age formula for aerobic training. I highly recommend you look into this. His couple of other books of his are listed here. If you look him up on the internet, you can get the whole rundown on his work. The 180 formula, I highly recommend you try this on yourselves if you're runners or cyclists. You take it's really simple to teach to patients, which is one of the things I love about it, and it really works. So you subtract your age from 180, and you modify this number by selecting one of the following categories. So if you are really behind the eight ball, just recovering from illness, and I would even say if you're older and have never been an exerciser, this would be the category you would be in. You subtract 10 from that. So for example, if you're 180, if you're 30 years old, you take 180 minus 30, that's 150. And you subtract 10 from that. That's going to be the top of your training zone. If you are maybe healthy, but you're just out of shape, maybe subtract 5. So it'd be like 145. If you are been exercising, but say you're coming back from an injury, you're basically pretty healthy, the C category, you can just go with the 150. Now, if you've been exercising all along, you don't have any injury, and you're just wanting to refine your training, then you could add 5. So it would be 155. So this example below, if you're category B, 180 minus 30 is 150, then 150 minus 5 is 145. That's going to be your top of your training zone. Likewise, if you're in the category D, where you add 5, you'd be at 155 would be your top of your training zone. Then you minus 10, so your training zone is going to be, for example, 135 to 145. If you're in category B, if you're category D, it would be, say, 145 to 155. And that's the zone you keep your heart rate in the whole time you're doing your activity. And it's going to seem like you're not working hard enough, but that's the whole idea. So what does like overtraining pushes us into sympathetic dominance, and this, of course, is just a list of the things that driving ourselves into sympathetic dominance all the time with any kind of stress is going to do to us. Remember, when we're in stress all the time, we can't digest our fats well, so we rely on carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are, of course, they're like trying to heat your house with newspaper in your wood stove. Likewise, parasympathetic is what we want to go into after we train. We want to go into our resting heart rate. We want to have our body be able to break down more complex molecules like fats and proteins. We want to have our immune system supported and rejuvenated, and this is what the parasympathetic state does for us. So how do we approach this? Well, number one, put them on a proper aerobic training. Get them educated in using the 180 formula, or get them at least monitoring their heart rate. Most adult endurance athletes don't. They do more bit by bit because now a lot of people have smart watches, which allows them to do that. But they need to be told what is, what they're really looking for. So the 180 formula is easy to teach patients. We've got to look at their adrenal function and what they're eating. So clean up their diet. That's a given. I mean, we could spend a whole weekend on that, but get them on good energy foods, good slow burning fats, healthy carbs, so on and so forth, and fix their adrenals, get their adrenals supported. And 3, get them to train more sensibly. There is a tendency for people to, especially with, well, aerobic or anaerobic training, but like things like weightlifting and strength training, people tend to be training too often. They're doing heavy weights too often, and they plug themselves into these routines that they find on the internet, which are often not appropriate for their level of fitness or their age or what else is going on with them. So it's important that people come in and says, I got the shoulder problem, it keeps coming back, and I keep working out, it's just not getting better. I'm like, well, how are you training? Well, they're just training. They're following some guy on the internet or some book or something, and they don't realize that their training is their problem. They think maybe they're not training enough, or it's just a problem that's separate from their training. So they need to be brought up to speed with what's going on with them. So anyway, this is going to feather into a discussion of essential fatty acids, which of course is essential for proper endurance training, essential for proper health. And this is not new to you folks. I know in this day and age, this is pretty well understood by modern day chiropractors and naturopaths, and even functional MDs are onto this. Mainstream medicine is still to this day fat phobic. They're starting to come around, but they're still 20, 30 years behind in their thinking. So now some people don't. There are people who are vegetarians or vegans, and they don't do any kind of animal fats, and that's fine. But you need healthy, vegetable fats if you're not going to do animal fats. Grass-fed beef, for example, has a high level of omega-3 fatty acids, and it has a high level of the healthy omega-6s. Feedlot, force-fed beef, of course, has much different types of fats. So that's an issue you can discuss with your patients. There is a book called Know Your Fat. It's been around quite a while, by Mary Enig. Highly recommend you take a look at that book if you haven't already. She's a biochemist, and she really gives you all the information you'd ever want to know about fats in that book. So any kind of fat that has been manufactured, stay away from it. Any fat that will sit on your shelf for a year and not go rancid, you don't want to eat it. Any fat that started out as a liquid and became a solid at room temperature, you don't want to eat it. Bottom line. This is the 3 main categories of fats that we kind of look at. Omega-6s, your standard olive oils, coconut oil is high in omega-6s. Omega-3s, of course, are going to be the northern fishes, the fishes who have to make a lot of fat. Salmon, wheat germ oil, sesame seed oil, if you can tolerate. I find some people don't tolerate, I'm one of them, don't tolerate sesame too well. But you can just experiment with that. Flax oil is good. Now, arachidonic acid is high in animal fats. Now, how does that fit in with inflammation? Once again, this is probably review for all of you, but when we look at prostaglandin formation, which is what is really instigating inflammatory pathways. The omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. They very easily can be converted into PG3s, which are anti-inflammatory. PG1s, the healthy sixes, can be converted into PG1s, which are also anti-inflammatory. The arachidonic acids are easily converted into PG2s. So if a diet is high in animal fats, if it's high in all kinds of other nasty things that tend to be pro-inflammatory, you're going to get a high level of PG2s, pro-inflammatory prostaglandins, going on. Now, the use of NSAIDs, once again, this is review. I know the use of NSAIDs, COX-2 inhibitors, they will interfere with all three of these pathways. So not only do they decrease the pro-inflammatory pathways, which is why they work so well, they also will inhibit your anti-inflammatory pathways. So NSAIDs are a very short-term fix at best, need to be used with caution. There's about, on average, 15,000 deaths a year attributed to GI bleeding directly associated with excess NSAID use in this country. And that's been going on for years. 15,000 people. And those are just the deaths that are directly attributed to NSAIDs. Anyway, here's a couple of books to look at. Western Price Foundation, the website, has tons of good information on fats. Tripping lightly down the prostaglandin path. This is by Mary Ennig, who also wrote Know Your Fats, and Sally Fallon. Highly recommend you check those out. Anyway, like I mentioned, grass-fed beef has a high level of omega-3s, so it has a lot to do with free-range grass-fed animals have healthier fat than animals that are put in pens and force-fed. Bottom line. It's another chart here that shows you how the different fats convert. And hopefully we'll do some testing on fats. They're one of the things I really like oral testing. It seems to work pretty well, doing oral challenge. So often we find people are deficient, they need omega-3s. That's pretty common. However, a lot of times they're eating a lot of omega-3s. Their diet is already rich in omega-3s. When that is the case, look at their digestive function, liver, gallbladder function, how well their gut's working. I check ICV, stomach. All of those things are really important. One of the things that is important to remember is that if stomach acid is sufficient, the body's producing good HCl, we're going to be able to break down our peptide bonds in our protein by activating pepsinogen into pepsin. We're also going to be able to ionize our minerals in our food with proper stomach acid. Another thing that happens is that when the acid is at a sufficient level and when the acidic chyme leaves the stomach, it's one of the things that triggers gallbladder, healthy, thorough gallbladder emptying. So digestion, the dynamic of digestion starts in the mouth. Of course, proper chewing, proper salivary enzymes, and then of course acidity in the stomach. And of course we need proper zinc levels, B6, things like that to make hydrochloric acid. We need to be in a parasympathetic state. to make stomach acid. And so if we set up those pH and enzyme activity dynamics from the beginning to the end, then we're going to have good gallbladder function. So we never just look at one part of the digestive piece. We always have to look up and downstream. Always look upstream when you have a digestion problem. If you have an ICV problem that keeps coming back, look at the gallbladder, look at the small intestine, look at the stomach, look at how people are chewing, look at their teeth, and of course look at what they're eating. Okay, the next piece is going to be scoliosis, and we're going to end there.